June 22, 1940. Within a railway carriage nestled in the Compiègne forest, the very same carriage where Germany had previously sealed its defeat in 1918, French delegates affixed their signatures to an armistice agreement with Nazi Germany. 6 weeks of intense conflict had claimed the lives of 90,000 French soldiers and 60,000 French civilians. 10 million people had sought refuge in the south, marking the largest displacement of population in European history. Now the conflict was concluded. France had capitulated. However, across the English Channel, Winston Churchill declared Britain's resolve to persevere alone. In the streets of Paris, now under German occupation, in the hamlets of Normandy, still scarred by aerial bombardments, and in the non-occupied southern territories, where displaced individuals crowded every available space, French citizens absorbed this news, their reactions diverging in ways that might astonish you. Their responses offer profound insights into the nature of defeat, the persistence of hope, and the emotional toll of witnessing one's nation succumb while an ally stands resolute. The reactions manifested along unexpected ideological lines. Simone de Beauvoir, aged 32, sat in a Parisian café, now frequented by German officers. She confided in her diary a sense of disquieted relief following the armistice. The bloodshed had ceased, and her friends were no longer perishing. Yet, upon learning of Britain's refusal to surrender, she penned a different sentiment. The English were irrational. They would face invasion within mere weeks. What, then, was the purpose of all their past sacrifices? This sentiment was not isolated. Throughout Paris and occupied France, many shared her weariness. They had witnessed their armed forces crumble in just 6 weeks, their roads choked with refugees, dive bombers overhead, and tanks rumbling past seemingly immutable landmarks. The notion that Britain, with its depleted army evacuated from Dunkirk, stripped of all its heavy equipment, could possibly vanquish Germany seemed fantastical. A woman in Lyon, her identity lost to the annals of history, but her words preserved in correspondence, wrote to her sister in America, "The British fled at Dunkirk, abandoning us to confront the Germans alone. Now, they proclaim, they will continue the fight. Let them. We have endured enough warfare." This resentment towards Britain was palpable and widespread. While the British Expeditionary Force had successfully evacuated 338,000 soldiers from Dunkirk, including 123,000 French troops, they had been compelled to leave behind all their heavy weaponry, effectively abandoning France to fight without their substantial support. Now, from the perceived safety of their island, they characterized France's capitulation as dishonorable. In the bistros of Marseille and in Vichy, the provisional capital where Marshal Pétain's new government was coalescing, a cynical jest circulated. The British will fight until the last French soldier. Yet, venturing into different districts and conversing with other individuals revealed a contrasting perspective. In a village in Brittany, a fisherman named Jean-Marie Cervella stood on the shore, gazing across the channel towards England. At 41 years of age, he was too old for military service, but both of his sons had been taken prisoner during the fighting, their fates unknown. When he heard of Churchill's vow to continue the struggle, he experienced an unexpected surge of hope. He confided in his wife, "If the English persist in their fight, then this is not the end. Perhaps then my boys will return home." In the unoccupied territories, across numerous towns and villages in southern France, many viewed Britain's steadfastness not as folly, but as sheer bravery. A school teacher in Toulouse recorded in her journal, "Marshal Pétain insists we must accept defeat with dignity, yet the English outright refuse to yield. Which attitude displays greater dignity?" The existing class structures played a significant role. The bourgeoisie, property owners, and established families generally endorsed Pétain's armistice. Their world had been turned upside down, and the armistice offered a promise of stability, order, and a return to traditional values. Pétain's rhetoric of work, family, and fatherland resonated deeply with them. Britain's unwavering determination to fight on threatened to prolong the prevailing chaos. However, among the working classes, those with left-leaning sympathies, and individuals who had always harbored skepticism towards the establishment, Britain's decision to persevere ignited a different sentiment. A factory worker in Saint-Étienne remarked to his colleagues, "The wealthy have brokered peace with the Germans, but the English workers continue to resist. Perhaps this war is not yet concluded." The regional disparities were stark. In the occupied north, where German soldiers patrolled the thoroughfares and German directives governed daily existence, openly endorsing Britain carried considerable risk. Individuals kept their true thoughts concealed, tuning in to BBC broadcasts in secret, with the radio volume kept low and curtains drawn. When they intercepted the BBC's French service reporting on British resolve, some felt a flicker of a sentiment they believed had been extinguished. Others suspected the BBC of disseminating falsehoods, predicting Britain's imminent collapse. In the unoccupied South, within the Vichy-controlled zone, there was greater liberty of expression, but the official narrative was unambiguous. Pétain's regime blamed Britain for France's defeat. Newspapers, now under Vichy's sway, published articles denouncing Britain's abandonment of France and prognosticated Germany's invasion of Britain within a month, suggesting France had acted prudently by seeking peace. Many subscribed to this viewpoint. A merchant in Vichy itself wrote to his brother, "Pétain has safeguarded France from utter devastation. The Marshal comprehends his course of action. The English are exhibiting obstinacy and foolishness. When they are invaded, they will regret not having sought peace, as we did." However, others discerned a deeper message. A librarian in Clermont-Ferrand observed, "The Vichy press dedicates considerable attention to asserting that Britain will soon be defeated. If they were truly confident," she remarked to her husband, "they would not feel the need to reiterate this so frequently." Then came the 3rd of July, 1940. The British Royal Navy launched an assault on the French fleet stationed at Mers el-Kébir in Algeria. The British harbored concerns that these French vessels might fall into German hands. The French admiral refused to surrender his fleet or escort it to British ports. Consequently, the British opened fire, resulting in the deaths of 1,297 French sailors. The news of this event sent shockwaves across France. In Paris, Lyon, Marseille, and villages in both occupied and unoccupied zones, French civilians reacted with dismay and outrage. Even those who had previously expressed sympathy for Britain's decision to continue fighting felt a sense of betrayal. The British had inflicted casualties upon French sailors. Former allies had become assailants. A woman in Bordeaux, whose cousin perished at Mers el-Kébir, confided in her diary, I had wished to believe the English were our allies, that they would one day liberate us. Now I realize they are as much our adversaries as the Germans. They have murdered our young men. Vichy propaganda capitalized on the incident. Posters depicting British warships firing upon French sailors appeared, and newspapers proclaimed headlines of British perfidy. Pétain himself condemned the hateful aggression. For several weeks, French public opinion shifted decisively against Britain. Even clandestine resistance fighters, those who harbored deep animosity towards the Vichy regime, grappled with Britain's actions. A young man in Paris, who would later join the resistance, reflected years afterward, "Marshal Pétain's pronouncements instilled in me a hatred for the English for months. While I understood the strategic rationale behind their actions, comprehension did not assuage the animosity." However, what transpired next was remarkable. This animosity did not endure universally. As summer transitioned into autumn, and the Battle of Britain raged in the skies above England, a subtle transformation began to occur. German bombers crossed the Channel daily. The Luftwaffe was expected to subdue Britain within weeks. Vichy newspapers confidently predicted British capitulation. German newsreels showcased burning British cities. The invasion, codenamed Operation Sea Lion, was anticipated imminently. Yet Britain refused to surrender. The Royal Air Force mounted a formidable defense. German losses mounted. Weeks elapsed, then months, and Britain remained steadfast, continuing its resistance with unwavering defiance. French civilians took notice. In occupied Paris, a baker named Henri Dubois listened to the BBC on a concealed radio. He heard reports of RAF victories and the downing of German bombers. While uncertain whether this was mere propaganda or if the British were exaggerating their successes, he perceived a growing unease among the Germans. The invasion that was initially slated for August, then postponed to September, never materialized. "Perhaps," he whispered to his wife in their bedroom, "the English are not as defeated as we had supposed." In the unoccupied South, a farmer observed German newsreels at the cinema. They depicted ablaze British cities, but also conveyed a different message: the resilience of the British populace and Churchill's resolute speeches. The farmer, who had initially dismissed Britain's decision to fight on as suicidal recklessness, began to harbor doubts. By the winter of 1940 to 1941, French public opinion started to shift once more. This transformation was not uniform across all segments of society, but in specific circles and hearts, Britain's continued existence began to influence calculations. A young woman in Lyon, Lucy Aubrac, who would later emerge as a prominent resistance leader, wrote retrospectively about this period. "When Britain did not fall, when they weathered the bombing, when they persisted in their fight month after month, something within us altered. It made resistance seem attainable. If they could stand alone against Germany, perhaps we did not have to accept defeat either." The existing class divisions persisted, but evolved. The bourgeoisie, who had aligned themselves with Vichy, began to hedge their positions. The possibility of British survival emerged, potentially altering the trajectory of Germany's victory. Prudence dictated a cautious approach in public discourse. A businessman in Toulouse, who had initially lauded Pétain's wisdom in pursuing peace, started to suggest to others that he had always anticipated Britain's endurance. Among the working classes and the left-leaning populace, Britain's survival fueled a burgeoning resistance. Communist workers in Paris, despite the subsisting Nazi-Soviet pact, viewed Britain's struggle as tangible evidence that fascism could be effectively opposed. Socialist workers in Marseille commenced organizing efforts, drawing inspiration and courage from Britain's example. However, the regional divide deepened. In the occupied North, German control was absolute. Any expression of support for Britain, even in private, posed significant peril. The Gestapo and French collaborationist police apprehended individuals suspected of listening to the BBC, disseminating what they deemed Gaullist propaganda, or expressing optimism regarding British triumph. A woman in Lille was detained for voicing her hope for a British victory and subsequently served 6 months in prison. In the unoccupied South, individuals had greater latitude for contemplation and careful discourse, and for nurturing hope. The Vichy government officially maintained its opposition to Britain, yet it could not exert complete control over every conversation. In private homes, during intimate moments, discussions about the potential implications of Britain's continued existence took place. A teacher in Montpellier assigned his students essays on the war. One 14-year-old student wrote, "Marshal Pétain asserts that we must accept our defeat, but the English demonstrate that refusal of defeat is possible. I am uncertain who is correct, but I am aware of which perspective evokes less shame within me." The teacher discreetly preserved the essay, refraining from reporting it to the authorities, sensing that the young student's insight might hold considerable weight. By 1941 and 1942, as Britain not only endured but began to reclaim the initiative, and as the war expanded to encompass Russia and subsequently America, French civilian sentiment continued its intricate metamorphosis. Those who had initially dismissed Britain's decision to fight on as misguided obstinacy now perceived it as prescient strategic foresight. Those who had harbored resentment over Britain's abandonment now harbored aspirations for British liberation. Those who had initially endorsed Vichy's collaborationist stance began to subtly distance themselves from it. Yet the situation remained far from straightforward. A woman in Paris, whose brother had been killed at Mers-el-Kébir, never extended forgiveness to Britain, even after the eventual liberation. A man in Bordeaux, who had extolled British courage in 1940, subsequently became a collaborator in 1942, having concluded that Germany would ultimately prevail. A family in Normandy found themselves divided. The father supported Vichy, while his sons joined the resistance, inspired by the British example, and his daughter married a German officer. The spectrum of French opinions and the complexity of their responses offered a profound revelation about the intertwined nature of defeat and hope. When France capitulated and Britain persisted, French civilians did not exhibit a unified reaction. Instead, their responses represented the sentiments of millions of individuals, each shaped by their unique fears, aspirations, and calculations concerning survival, dignity, and the unfolding future. Some viewed British defiance as noble, others as imprudent, and some perceived it as a combination of both. Some altered their perspectives over time, while others remained steadfast in their initial judgments. A man in Toulouse, who had been captured and subsequently released during the fighting, wrote to his sister in 1943, "When we surrendered and the English continued to fight, I considered them fools. I believed they would be overrun within weeks, and we would all inevitably fall under German dominion. Therefore, what was the rationale for further bloodshed?" He continued, But they were not invaded. They persevered. And now I am part of the resistance. The English were correct. Some principles are worth defending, even in the face of overwhelming loss. His sister, however, responded, "You claim the English were correct, but how many more French lives were lost because they prolonged the conflict? How many more cities were reduced to rubble? Perhaps if all had sought peace in 1940, we would all be alive and intact. It is possible the English merely extended the period of suffering." Both missives have been preserved in archival collections, each representing a valid perspective, and neither offers a complete picture without the other. The narrative of what French civilians articulated when Britain continued its fight while France surrendered is not a singular account, but rather a chronicle of millions of evolving reactions, influenced by social class, regional origin, political ideology, personal experiences, hope, fear, and animosity, all intermingled. In the occupied North, a woman concealed a downed British pilot, risking her life to facilitate his escape. When questioned later about her actions, she explained, "Because when we surrendered, they did not. Someone had to remember that resistance remained a possibility." In the same city, just a few streets away, another woman reported a neighbor for listening to the BBC. She subscribed to Pétain's vision of a reconfigured France at peace with Germany, and believed the British were unnecessarily prolonging the war. She was not inherently malevolent, but rather a woman attempting to navigate her circumstances and place her trust in the authorities who advocated collaboration as the path to peace. In the southern zone, the mayor of a small village refused to implement Vichy's anti-Jewish statutes. When questioned about his stance, he stated, "The English are still fighting. This signifies that the situation is not irrevocably settled. Consequently, we are not compelled to comply with these directives." His actions resulted in the salvation of 17 Jewish families. In the adjacent village, another mayor enthusiastically enforced the same discriminatory laws, convinced that Vichy represented France's future. He viewed Britain's continued resistance as a British concern, entirely separate from French affairs, and saw no correlation between British defiance and his own decisions. By 1944, as Allied forces prepared for the invasion and the resistance movement gained momentum, leading to the erosion of Vichy's authority, French public opinion had undergone a dramatic reversal. The majority of French civilians now anticipated Allied liberation and largely acknowledged the wisdom of Britain's decision to continue fighting. However, this perspective is informed by hindsight, viewed from the vantage point of eventual victory. In June 1940, standing amidst the devastation of defeat, observing their nation's surrender while their ally pressed on, French civilians had no means of foreseeing the ultimate outcome. They were compelled to interpret events based on the information available to them, their fears, their hopes, and their profound exhaustion and anger, elements that collectively define the human condition. Some perceived British defiance as noble defiance. Others deemed it foolish. Some viewed it as a complex mixture of both. Certain individuals revised their opinions over time, while others remained unwavering in their initial assessments. An elderly woman in Provence, when asked in 1945 about her thoughts when Britain continued fighting while France surrendered, responded, "I believed they were insane. I anticipated their complete annihilation, and by extension, our own. Yet, deep down, I also harbored a faint suspicion that perhaps madness was precisely what the moment demanded. Perhaps sanity lay in surrender, while madness embodied hope. And perhaps, just perhaps, we required more of that madness. She paused, then looked at the interviewer. I was right. We needed the madness. We needed someone to reject the logic of defeat, even if it was the English, even if they had abandoned us at Dunkirk, even if they had killed our sailors at Mers el-Kabir. We needed someone to demonstrate that defiance was still a viable option. She then added, although I did not grasp that in 1940. In 1940, I simply thought they were insane. That uncertainty, the lack of foresight, the experience of living through history without knowing its conclusion, this was the reality for French civilians in the summer of 1940. They were unaware that Britain would endure. They did not know America would enter the war. They had no certainty of their own liberation. Their sole knowledge was that their country had surrendered while their ally had not, and they were tasked with discerning the implications of this divergence. Their conclusions varied because they were human beings, exhibiting the inherent complexity of humanity. The forces of defeat and hope, fear and courage, do not adhere to simplistic patterns. Some French civilians lauded Britain's resolve, others reviled it. Some experienced both emotions. Some altered their perspectives subsequently, while others never wavered. What they articulated when Britain fought on, while France surrendered, encompassed everything: anger and admiration, despair and hope, betrayal and inspiration, all intertwined. Millions of voices responded to an unprecedented moment in millions of distinct ways. This complexity, this refusal to conform to a simplistic narrative, is precisely what renders their reactions so profoundly human, so authentic, and so worthy of remembrance. They were not characters in a drama with clearly defined heroes and villains. They were individuals striving to survive, endeavoring to comprehend a catastrophe, and attempting to determine what to believe as their world disintegrated around them. Some grasped the situation accurately, others misinterpreted it, most likely perceived it partly correctly and partly incorrectly, much as any of us would have in their place, and much as we do now when confronted with our own insurmountable challenges and forced to decide between surrender and resistance, between hope and despair, between viewing defiance as courage or as sheer madness. The French civilians of 1940 were unaware they were forging history. They were merely striving to endure it. Their words, their thoughts, their feelings, all were genuine, all held validity, and all contributed to the vast, intricate truth of what it signifies to witness one's world unravel and be compelled to chart a course for what lies ahead.